Our speaker now is Dr. Paul Schervish, Director of the Center of Wealth and Philanthropy at Boston College. He's done years and years of work studying wealth holders and is probably best known for his research that he and his colleagues have done that projects a 50-year wealth transfer in America of $41 trillion. We'll ask him about that this morning. Dr. Schervish is a recognized expert in the world of giving behavior and has been selected 5 times by the publication Nonprofit Times for the Power and Influence Top 50 of the nonprofit sector. He's been a Fulbright Scholar of Philanthropy. He's also taught University College Cork and has been Distinguished Visiting Professor at Indiana University's Center on Philanthropy. In the interest of time, I'll refer you to his background in the book. He did not want a long introduction, but I will put a plug for his new book, which is called Wealth and the Will of God, Discerning Riches in the Services of Ultimate Purpose. It was just published by Indiana University Press in February, so I recommend that. This morning, Paul will talk about the moral biography of wealth, the new physics of philanthropy. Would you welcome, please, Dr. Paul Schervish.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's an honor to be here. I have spoken with and gotten to know several of you over the years, but most of you I have not had a chance to speak with or to address. Nevertheless, I find that it is people like you who are members of the clergy, active lay people, about whom I have studied and written over the years. I say this because our work has always been this intersection of spiritual life and the life of money and wealth. Now, I have been encouraged to at least bring up the topic of Franciscans, Jesuits, and Dominicans. I won't tell a long story. I will just ask you if you've heard the one about the Franciscan, Dominican, and the Jesuit who walked into a bar and said, "Have you heard the one about us?" I have a lot to go over today, and I'll try to be conscious of our time. The starting point for what I want to say is the framework of what you have been discussing and been advocating for several years now. And what I hope to do, and I discussed this with Frank, is to provide a framework for the administrative innovations, the organizational developments that you are hoping to introduce and sustain in the church. In my view, I look at some of the things that Aristotle said and try to apply them to our daily life. One of them is that Aristotle has suggested that each one of us take what our immediate purpose is and see in what way it is a means to another deeper purpose. And so that we trace deeper, more deeply, what is it that we are up to. And I think that in the end, all of your work and all of my work is addressing the question of people's experience of God. And so I want to talk about this in the context of a financial ministry, a financial spirituality, a spirituality of wealth. I'm going to tell a little story. It's a Sufi story about an old couple that lives in the forest. And one evening, a knock comes at their door, and the person says, "Do you have some food and shelter for a wayfarer?" And the old couple says generously, "We have soup, and we can add a little water to the soup and share it with you." And when dinner is over, they save what is left over. And the next night, another wayfarer comes, and says, do you have something to provide a hungry wayfarer and some shelter? And yes, we do. We can add a little water to the soup. And soon this procedure goes on, and they are eventually, as you all can understand, serving the soup of the soup of the soup, which is water. Now, I think that is an analogy of what is going on in our church today in many ways. That very generous people are attempting to provide nourishment to very hungry and thirsty people who are looking for nourishment. But we are serving, in many cases, with generosity and with care, water. And we are accepting water as our nourishment because we are so hungry and thirsty. And so the question for all of us is, how do we enrich the soup? And I think one arena in which we need to enrich the soup is the arena of wealth and spiritual life. I think that a new era has commenced in the level of wealth in the U.S. and across the world. Never before have so many individuals at such an early age had the time, energy, and potential interest to direct great wealth to address great material, cultural, and spiritual needs. For this wealth to be directed toward deeper purposes, people need to discern not just their level of financial wherewithal, but their attraction to and responsibility for allocating their wealth. In addition, they require the spiritual strength to carry out their choices in the search for greater happiness, which I operationalize as this combination of effectiveness and significance. And this greater happiness is for oneself and others simultaneously. Now, the distinctive trait of wealth holders in all generations is that they enjoy the fullest range of choice in determining and fulfilling who they want to become and what they want to do for themselves, their families, and the world around them. Today, increasing numbers of individuals are approaching or achieving or even exceeding their financial goals with respect to the provision for their material needs, and they're doing so at a younger and younger age. A level of affluence that heretofore was simply the province of a scattering of rulers, generals, merchants, financiers, and industrialists has come to characterize a whole group of people in our world, and indeed whole sections of society. For the first time in history, the question of how to align broad material capacity of choice with spiritual capacity of character has been placed before so many people of the world. For the first time in history, we possess the confluence of immediate knowledge of human needs, the material resources to solve and not just ameliorate those needs, and the scientific and organizational capacity to implement solutions. But the greatest need is to animate in a contemporary way the spiritual desire and will of generosity by which people will allocate their wealth for the benefit of humanity. I think that one of the leading questions of the 21st century is how individuals will allocate their wealth as a tool for deeper purposes. A tool for deeper purposes when acquiring more wealth or a higher standard of living is no longer of high importance. Now, I want to broaden this perspective a little bit and talk about what is the nature of a wealth holder, and this has to do with the notion of moral biography. Moral biography is very simply something you all know, and 2 out of my 3 kids have. One of them's a sleazebag. But I'll talk about him a little later and how he has come not to be a sleazebag. A moral biography is this link between capacity, which is latent until put into practice by a aspiration or a purpose. So let's look at capacity and a number of synonyms for that. Choice, freedom. When we talk to wealth holders, they virtually always explain what the meaning of wealth is as having the great capacity of freedom from, freedom to, which comes down to choice. Another aspect of this would be skills. It would be good looks. It would be a charismatic personality. It can be intellect. It can be any of the capacities, including wealth and even an army. And all of this is latent until put into practice, as I said, by purpose, moral compass, values, objectives, and so on. And when this is implemented, we find this to be a moral biography. Now, there are many examples of moral biographies that we all know, including our own. But this is described in the great epics. It's the story of Moses. It's the story of Jesus. And you see in both cases, they're combining miraculous and great power with a purpose that very often is associated with a geographical movement and not just a psychological or spiritual deepening. But this moral biography shows up very commonly in our comic book characters. And you see this carried out by Luke Skywalker, Superman, Sheena of the Jungle. And what we find in each one of these cases is that there is a set of episodes of a moral biography. An episode in which there is a deepening, a learning, in which capacity sometimes outstrips aspiration or purpose. And then the person, like Luke Skywalker, gets himself and everybody else in trouble. Or purpose outstrips capacity, and once again, Luke Skywalker, Moses gets themselves and everybody else into trouble. Given this, I want to talk about, more specifically for a moment, the moral biography of wealth. Now, what is distinctive, I said, is this realm of choice. And the moral biography of wealth revolves around this notion of what I call hyper-agency. A hyper-agent is an agent, and an agent does or acts. And to make it kind of immediate, let me simply say that a hyper-agent is able to do single-handedly what it takes a social movement, a political movement, or a philanthropic movement of many people to do otherwise. Most of us are living our lives attempting to find our place that is best, to find our vocation in the world. Hyper-agents have the privilege and the dangerous responsibility at times of not just finding their place in the world, but being founders. Founders of institutions, founders of organizations, founders of new directions of thought, founders of cultural trends. Now, of course, wealth holders are not the only hyper-agents. Mother Teresa was one, of course. And many of you are hyper-agents in your own realms. But hyper-agency comes with this power of electricity or fire, where it can be very destructive or very potentially caring. Given this, let me talk first about the moral biography of capacity among wealth holders. Now, we talked about the wealth transfer. This 41 trillion in 2007 dollars is actually now about 52, 57 trillion. Now, you wonder what has happened given this great recession, and it is important to keep that in mind. Wealth reached its peak in the United States in the year 2007 and has declined about 24% since then. But since the end of 2009 through the first quarters of 2010, wealth has begun to increase again at about a 10% rate per quarter. We expect that not only will this wealth transfer occur, but that it's going to occur at a level greater than what we have mentioned. Our prediction included only a 2% annual rate of growth in wealth. In fact, since 1950, the real annual rate of growth in wealth has been greater than 3%, including 10 recessions and the one that we are now in. And so our 3% estimate is probably more likely to occur, and that is closer to 92 trillion. But even then, we are finding that what is being transferred to heirs is greater than what we predicted would be transferred to heirs, charity, and taxes. So that there is this abundance that is there, despite what we have found in the last few years, the shaking of the sense of financial security. And that's an important point because in our research we have found that one of the most important predictors of charitable giving across the economic spectrum, from low income to the very wealthy, is how financially secure people feel. And just at the upper end, our research has shown that for each group that increases its self-reported sense of financial security, charitable giving is greater, both as percentage of income, percentage of wealth, and therefore in amount. Controlling for each category of income and wealth. Among regular people, the bottom 95% of the population, our research has also shown that, not talking about wealth because that's not in the data, but that income, confidence about the family's future income success leads to higher charitable giving in each income group. Now, I mention this because what we are finding today, that when the security is shaken, so much more depends upon our inner character and our inner spirituality. We have, in our research, taken up this issue by addressing what is the meaning, what is the motivation, what is the inner life of philanthropy. And I want to say that in our point of view, which is a very Catholic and Ignatian point of view, that it doesn't really matter when we distinguish between formal philanthropy and informal or personal care with our resources for our families and our friends. Not counted among any of the formal philanthropy in the nation is $100 billion a year in remittances by immigrants mainly to their families and close friends in their home country. In addition, despite the downturn in philanthropy of $25 billion worth of individual giving, not corporate or foundation giving. In individual giving, I just lost my place. What did I say? Yes, remittance. Yes, thank you. In addition to remittances not being included, is what we found in our Boston Diary study, where we followed 43 families for a year, talking to them once a week. And in those families, we found that their formal philanthropy was almost to the dollar what was estimated to be the average household charitable giving in the nation. But in addition to what they gave in formally recognized charitable giving was 5 times more than the $1,700 to family members not living with them and to individuals that were their associates or friends. So we find that there is a great inner life of generosity of people. And this is what I want to talk about as this issue in Aristotle and in many of the ancient writers, this notion of philia. Now, being in Philadelphia, we get a great sense of the richer meaning of philia when we talk about Philadelphia as the city of brotherly love. But when we talk about philanthropy, we think of it as love of humanity. For Aristotle, philia is a certain kind of love. It's friendship love. It's mutual nourishment. And we want to understand that people are in this mutual nourishment from the time that they are parents or children. And it is this core experience of nourishing people as if they were yourself. Aristotle says, a friend is another myself. So instead of looking at what is altruism in the modern sense, or what is selfishness, our research has indicated that neither of those two notions capture the meaning of this personal care that gets expressed formally in philanthropy at times. Rather, instead of the absence of self, we talk about the quality of self. And the quality of self that most matters in the mutual nourishment is the quality of identification with the fate of others as if they were myself, my parents, my children. And so that is the major, we find, motivation, mobilizing factor in care for others. If identification is the school of care, the school of identification is contact. They say, thank your donors 7 times. I point out that we need to show our donors their connection 7 times. In addition to talking about the notion of philia, let me just mention what this Jesuit teacher of mine, Jules Toner, taught us about care. He says, care is love implemented. And what is care implemented? It is meeting the true needs of others. You can always argue what true needs are, like the time my daughter, our first kid, who never got any sweets for dessert, you all know how that works. The third kid, you say, you can't have any dinner until you finish your ice cream. She said, I need candy. Well, you can argue over what true needs are, but it's the right question, is it not? Now, given that, let me see if I can talk about a positive definition of philanthropy, both in its very personal sense and in its more institutional sense. And to do this, I want to just have you recall Jean Valjean and the play, the musical Les Miserables, or the book. It's like when I talk about Moses, I say you don't have to have read the book, you just have to have seen the movie. Now, in Les Mis, we find that Jean Valjean has a family, and he has stolen bread for the care of his sister and his niece, and he's jailed. And as the show goes on, we hear that Fantine comes to Jean Valjean and says, "Will you care for my daughter Cosette?" And he says, "This day she will be in my house." And you notice he doesn't just take care of Cosette, he cares for himself. He becomes a father. He becomes connected to a family which he had lost at the beginning of the story. So Cosette becomes his daughter, he becomes the father. Now I want to point out that he was an industrialist and mayor. So on the one hand, he could have handled this situation by starting a government institution, an orphanage. He could have handled it by hiring Cosette at a greater wage than she was receiving from the Thénardiers, the bawdy family for whom she was working as a barmaid. But instead, he brought her into his home. The key to this, as you notice, is that Jean Valjean, if I came to interview him, or the government came to interview him, or any research group came to interview him about his philanthropy, he would have to say zero. Jesus would have to say zero. Moses would have to say zero. My mom and dad would probably have to say virtually zero. But there was abundance of philia. I was asked by a reporter what I would say to the gathering of Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and other billionaires who were called together in a short letter to meet and to discuss their role in philanthropy and coordination of it. What would I say to them? And I said what I would say to them is that yes, they have been a model of teaching all of us and setting out for our culture the important role of formal philanthropy. But if they do not understand what our parents understand, what you understand in your daily life, what common people who send remittances back to their families understand, if they do not understand that core experience that others are myself, they are but a clanging cymbal. And so, in reality, we people have more to teach them or to caution them about or to make sure they understand than in some ways they have to teach us. And so my positive definition of philanthropy that gets us beyond the notion of a nonprofit sector, non-governmental sector. You hear this third sector. We have all these residual notions. It's not government, it's not for-profit, it's not the economy or the political sector, it's something third. And we don't have a good positive definition. And I'll just do this briefly and talk about any of you who have bought a car recently. And we all know that General Motors sold one car a year ago, and now they have a 30% increase over their sales a year ago. You got to be careful of statistics like that. If you bought a car, you were on the demand side, and the seller of the car was on the supply side. How did you get the car? People said, I went to the dealer. Other people say, I chose the car. Other people say, I did this or that. But the basic answer is, I showed the dealer the money. And they call that in economic terms effective demand. That is, for the dealer to continue to survive, the dealer must pay attention to the expenditures of the people on the demand side. So in many ways, you all know this who are in business, you have to pay attention not just to the need, but to how the need is expressed. And that is the economic sector. It also works that way in politics, ultimately. There's effective demand. How do you have the will of what the consumers or the demand side want? You provide dollars or votes to the politician. And if you withdraw those, the politician or the car dealer suffers materially. Now, Jean Valjean and you or I, when we are engaged in philia, are not engaged in effective demand. Think about somebody that needs a car to get to work, and there's a charity that provides automobiles for those who need to work in the suburbs, but for whom there is no public transportation. In that case, the person on the demand side has no way to direct or to coerce the person on the supply side. Jean Valjean had nothing material to lose if he didn't pay attention to Cosette. So what I want to point out is that with philia, we are paying attention to the person in need rather than to the medium through which the need is expressed. So philia, whether you're taking care of your babies, whether you're taking care of your parents, whether you are contributing large amounts for the education of inner city children, whatever you are doing, you are paying attention directly to the person in need. And isn't that a great privilege? What is one of the greatest experiences you have ever had in your life? It is simply being able to meet the needs of those with whom you identify as another myself. And what a great privilege that is for all of us, and not just wealth holders. Let me conclude by making a call in some ways for a new pastoral encyclical from ourselves as lay people, from ourselves as bishops and priests and sisters, from ourselves as the church together. We need to write a new spirituality of wealth. The churches today, for the most part, understand a feudal spirituality, one of zero-sum growth in wealth. Wealth is gained because somebody else is destroyed. And we have this notion that what we ought to do with our wealth is be distributing it, and we don't have a spirituality of the productive activity of wealth and growth in wealth. But there are people who understand this, even though we don't hear it often from our pulpits. The people that understand this are very often financial advisors, fundraisers, spiritual teachers who talk with wealth holders. For the people going through this with themselves, with their hearts, with their families, with their children, are the ones who are creating an emerging language, experience of the intersection of wealth and the experience of God. And we need to learn that more in our church. When we were a young church in the United States, we had a spirituality of survival. And then we had a spirituality of immigration. And then we had a spirituality of moving from poverty to social mobility. But what we don't have yet is a solid, emerging voice of the people experience of what it is to find God in a life of financial wherewithal. And of course, this applies not only to the very wealthy, but to us who are highly affluent and have dramatic range of choice compared to what our parents had. In this encyclical, I would call upon us to go further than Benedict has gone in his encyclical on love. In that encyclical, he talks about love as eros, hoping to revitalize its sense in a deeper way, and agape. And he makes a reference to philia and says, I'm not going to speak about that because the only place it comes up in the Gospels or in the letters is in John's Gospel. And it comes up in John's Gospel in the section where Jesus is talking to his disciples and say, I no longer consider you my servants, but my friends, philios. And it comes up again at the end of John's Gospel in that famous tripartite question of Jesus to Peter, do you love me? And that is framed, as you biblical scholars have taught me, by a charcoal fire. There's only another charcoal fire in all of the Gospels, and that's when Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And there's a charcoal fire when Jesus is asking Peter, do you love me 3 times? And the first time Jesus says it, he uses agapeo. Do you love me? And Peter says, I'm your friend. I love you as a friend. The second time Peter is asked, do you love me by Jesus? Using agapeo. And Peter responds with phileo. The third time Jesus says, are you my friend? And Peter says, you know that I am your friend. And Jesus says, feed my lambs and feed my sheep. So I'm calling for an encyclical on philia, that root word of friendship love for all of this philanthropy that even Vatican II didn't address. There is only one reference in Gaudium et Spes to caritas as the giving of resources. Every other time it's referred to as this attitude of love. And Gaudium et Spes begins with saying, the hopes and joys, the fears and anxieties of the people of God are the joys and hopes, the fears and anxieties of the church. The realm that we have not addressed and need to do more in is the fears and anxieties, the joys and hopes around the spirituality, the spiritual life of wealth. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We might have one or two questions, and then we'll press on because we're a little over time. Thank you very much. You made a very persuasive case for a new spirituality of wealth, and I think your encyclical letter is going to help give us that great framework. Let me just maybe zero in on this notion of relationship, of connection, because that's so central to a lot of the writing and research that you've done. Is the problem of the underperformance of Catholic rank and file in the area of donations, is that attributable to that lack of connection, that lack of the kind of thing that you're talking about here, this philia, the sense of this is my family? What is that all about?
Yes, it is due to that in its broadest sense. In our research, we have found that there are 2 areas of the United States in which secular giving outstrips religious giving for individuals, the Northeast and the Northwest. In both of these areas, there is a large number of unchurched professionals, unchurched former Catholic professionals. So that's one dimension of it, the alienation of the professionals, especially the academic professionals, or those who are never involved in religion and are largely among the high-tech wealth holders. Another thing, of course, is the series of alienating, whether you think it's correctly alienating or not, from Humanae Vitae through the scandal of sexual abuse, which reinforces a lot of that negative identification, to the notion of free ridership. You belong to big parishes, and the ability for a large number of people to provide small amounts of money individually that enable the church to continue to survive is another issue. But I think, as the bishop pointed out, there is in sermons and in spiritual teaching only certain places where the soup is available. And that is, I think, the largest issue for the church today. And even this sexual abuse in Ireland took place way before all these authority issues took place. It took place long before and more broadly than Vatican Council was ever heard of. And I think that's important to understand, that there isn't simply this authority issue. It's a nourishment issue. And I think Catholics are those that have most experienced the loss of this nourishment.
Okay. Let's take a question from the audience here
Regrettably.
for observation.
Father Jim McGuinn from Philadelphia. I think we Catholics tend to be a little weak on this, but there's 4 great lists of spiritual gifts in the New Testament. Paul talks about it. Some people have the gift of administration, and some people have the gift of leadership, and some people have the gift of helps, and some people have the gift of evangelization, and some people have the gift of giving. It's a spiritual gift. It's in the Bible. Some people have the gift of giving. And as a Catholic church, we owe it to Catholics whom God has blessed to teach them about the spiritual gift of giving. Our evangelical brothers do it.
Yes.
And so they give. But just as a Catholic church, we're weak on the spiritual gifts, and one of them is that gift of giving. And we just have to get better at it. So,
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, Paul. Well, we'll going to thank
Right there,
you,
ma'am. Did you want to?
over here.
Oh, you were just stretching?
All right, go ahead.
No.
I was reluctantly deciding whether I was going to say anything. I'm Maggie McCarty with Education for Parish Service. And one of the things which is a nonprofit that teaches Catholics about their faith. We educate Catholics to understand, live, and share their faith with others. Very much connected to what the bishop was talking about earlier. But we've changed our way of fundraising in the last year, which I'm hoping is enough to hold on in these really rough economic times, in which we're telling the story of the lives that we affect through educating people about their faith. So we tell the stories of the mother who came because her kids were asking her questions about her faith, and she never learned that, and how the excitement about her faith then evangelized her husband, who came back to church with her, and her daughter is now helping in the teaching confirmation, and how a family of 4 was radically changed because the mother decided to come to class and learn more about her faith. And we're telling these stories, we're collecting these stories, because I think that storytelling is such a powerful medium in our age, and because I think people are bombarded with lots of opportunities to give. And I think choosing where you give, I think needs a personal touch. And
Absolutely.
so
I just want to say one brief thing about that we need to care for our donors as much as we care for our beneficiaries. When I teach at Boston College, we are absolutely interested in the personal formation as well as the intellectual formation, the spiritual formation of our students. But when they graduate, our tendency is to what? Treat them as instruments,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Now, one of the major changes that is taking place that encourages giving is that institutions are beginning to understand that instead of the donors being instruments for them to do good, these institutions are instruments for the donors to identify with the beneficiaries as another myself. You ask people in Katrina, to whom did they give? They'll say Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, the Red Cross. And then you ask them again, to whom did you really give? And they'll say, to the people. And we have to begin to encourage that nourishment of the donors in the same way we encourage the nourishment of the beneficiaries.
I'll just say, oh, Paul, I want to say one thing about this new model that we're doing, because we're also taking the message out to the people. It has to do with kind of this turning around everything we've done before, so that we're going back to our graduates, the instruments that often give back to our program, and taking it back into them so that we're not expecting them to come to us. It's wonderful, all of the new thoughts on fundraising and the effect that we hope that they're going to have. Thank you.
Paul, thanks so much.